Thank you all for coming. My name is Jane Ann Murray. I'm an associate clinical professor of law here at the school where I run the Clemency Clinic. And this past spring break, these wonderful four students came with me to the Netherlands to study the Dutch penal and criminal justice systems. It was a project that we started last year when we went to Norway and visited Halden, the most humane prison in the world. And so it got us thinking that we would want to start seeing other systems in Europe in particular where there's a much more humane approach than the harsh and punitive one that we have here in the United States. Um, we were drawn to the Netherlands in part because pretty cosmopolitan cities. It's a port city. It's kind of at a crossroads there in Europe, and so very interesting things happening there criminally, and yet they have one of the lowest incarceration rates in Europe, and have been decarcerating at a pretty heavy clip over the last decade or so, closing prisons and turning them into hotels and office centers. Um, I want to say, apart from saying special thanks to my wonderful students that made it such a great trip, I want to thank our very gracious hosts in the Netherlands, Arend de Korte, who was the warden of Terpeel, and you're going to hear from one of the students about that women's prison. Valerie Jellema, the legal advisor at Velsicht Transcultural Psychiatric Center. You're going to hear all about that from another student. Marika Liem of the University of Leiden. Judge Geert Janssen, who was at the Central Criminal Court in Amsterdam. Yamel Lampi, a formerly incarcerated individual who's founded a very successful coffee franchise for the formerly incarcerated. Dave Hovenga, who's the father of a son who's incarcerated and has co-founder of a foundation for relatives of incarcerated people. Kim Roloffs, who's a mediator in their criminal mediation program there, which you're going to hear about from one student. Very interesting, the idea of bringing criminal mediation into the concept of mediation into the criminal sphere, and especially Hert Jan Slump, who's with the Restorative Justice Netherlands project, and who introduced us to several of the individuals that I previously mentioned, and was just a wonderful host to us while we were there. Um, One thing that I remember that I'm always telling people about that trip is a question we asked Judge Janssen, and we said, "Look, Judge, what would you get if you did, say, a knife point robbery, and this was your first offense? What would you get in the Netherlands?" And he goes, "Ooh, 3 or 4." And we were thinking, 3 or 4 years. That's not terrible, but not you know unlike some sentences that might be meted out here. Oh, no, 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 not years, months. And then we said, "Well, what about your second knife point robbery? What would you get for that?" Ooh, we'd have to give you a lot more for that. 7 or 8 months. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my students to give you their presentation on what they experienced and observed in the Netherlands, and then we'll open it for Q&A. Thanks again.
Thank you, Professor Murray, and thanks again on behalf of all of us, the students, for organizing and taking us over to one of my homelands. My name is Sam Bijsman, or as they pronounce it in the Netherlands, Bijsman. It's a Dutch name, even though I'm mostly Swedish. So as I butcher some Dutch words in this presentation, please allow me a little bit of grace. So I'm here to talk to you about the Terpeel Penitentiary, which is the second largest women's prison in the Netherlands, and specifically their program for expecting or young mothers, asking ourselves the question, what can and what should we learn from Dutch prisons? So with that in mind, I think it's important to establish a little bit of context related to the Dutch penal system. First, the Netherlands in 2020 had a prison population of only 10,500 people, which is relatively low, especially compared to the United States. And roughly 6% of this prison population is women. So low prison population to begin with, an incredibly small comparative number of women in prison. And the average term, as Professor Murray was somewhat alluding to in her introduction, is that the average term of a prison sentence in the Netherlands is 6 months. We don't actually have comparative data for what the average prison sentence is in the United States because it varies so much by state jurisdiction. but we think in terms of years rather than in terms of months. And finally, to further exemplify that, it's estimated that only around 70 people in the entire Netherlands are serving some sort of life sentence. So when you're thinking throughout the rest of this presentation about the Dutch penal system in general, think fewer prisoners, shorter sentences. Now, to discuss the Terpeel Penitentiary specifically, it's located in the southeastern portion of the Netherlands. Amsterdam is up here. And this is what it looks like on Google Maps. It was actually began as a monastery built following World War II. You can see right here is the main monastery building, and then right here is the main church. Um, but in 1976, it was converted into a prison. It was first a male facility, but then in the 1980s, it shifted specifically into a women's facility. You can see some of the buildings here. They added here and here. This is an office facility, and then this is the main regular security compound. It houses 250 inmates, and it is the second largest women's prison in all of Holland. And there's three main facilities. There's the low security facility, which is in what constitutes the former monastery. Prisoners actually have a key to their cells and are allowed to come and go and roam the grounds as they please, provided that they're backed by curfew. There's the regular security facility, which is up here, and prisoners have a little bit more of security constraints upon them, but I took it when I was inside there to be very well lit in comparison to a lot of American prisons that are kind of light on windows. And finally, there is the Mother Met Kin House, which roughly translates to a mother and child home. And that's going to be the focus of our presentation today and discussion. So on the Motor Met Kin House, here it is kind of zoomed in from the Google Maps photo. It enables young mothers to actually raise their children inside of the Terpeel Penitentiary while they are serving their sentence. It has the capacity for 5 mother child pairs. And again, this is why it's important to remember the relatively low prison population in the Netherlands, because this is roughly adequate to address the need for these kinds of inmates in this country. The warden told us that there is a wait list to get on this program, but it constitutes only 2 people usually. Two mothers or types of mothers are essentially eligible for this. Mothers with children under 4 who are eligible to be in this program until their child ages out. That also essentially means that any mother with a prison term of longer than 4 years is going to be ineligible to this program because their child will age out. But again, the average prison term in the Netherlands is only about 3 months. And additionally, it houses pregnant mothers who are put in a separate housing and then are taken to a different facility to give birth, an actual hospital, but then may continue raising their child for 9 months while still on the inside in Terpeel. However, the preference is to place children outside. This program is specifically for single mothers or mothers who might not have any other sort of family outside of the prison walls who would be able to raise their child. It's essentially if the alternative would be foster care, you'll fit into this program. And it also offers the Bitair Start educational programming program, which for a time on the inside, these young mothers receive educational and behavioral programming, followed up by home visits after they are released from the prison. So, specifically, to look at some of the facilities, here's us on the outside of the kind of compound. And I apologize for some of these photos. We weren't able to take photos ourselves. It was the warden who was taking the photos, which was somewhat reasonable as some of the mothers were actually there and we didn't want to violate their privacy. But this is the outdoor recreational space right outside the main compound, which you can see right here is this kind of squat, almost cabiny looking building with big, tall, unbarred windows. You can see there's a lot of children's toys kind of scattered around in this grassy slash concrete playing area. And this was actually a facility where they were raising rabbits. 2 of, I swear, the biggest rabbits I had ever seen were being raised by the mothers and their young children in this facility. Additionally, this is what a common room looked like on the inside. You can see this circular table with kind of kids drawing materials around here. And back there is a communal kitchen that the mothers would all use communally to prepare meals for both them and their children. And that includes access to things like a block of knives and heavy pots and pans. So, some pretty significant permissions given to these young mothers. And additionally, these are what the cells look like. You can see that they're outfitted with things like baby cribs with mobiles and generally unbarred windows. And most of them I think all of them had a bathroom with a shower inside the facility. And additionally, the mothers could come and go from these cells as they wished during the day. And they were responsible for staying in them overnight during curfew. However, they did have limited permission to leave the cells and go to, say, the kitchen or something to fix up a snack for their child if that was something that needed to happen. So that leads us to the big question. Does it essentially work? And the short answer is we don't really know. The Dutch scholars who have looked into the Terpeel program specifically lament the lack of research specifically into these programs. And if you plug Terpeel into Westlaw or LexisNexis yourself, you're not going to find any studies specifically discussing it. Same thing if you go to a more general search engine like JSTOR, all you're going to get is some French typos. However, we do have some research on the Bit to Start program. In a trial in 2013, teachers who were responsible for teaching both the children of parents who were in the Bit to Start program and parents who were outside of the Bit to Start program reported better behavior from participants' children. But additionally, discussing if this is a good idea in theory is actually a really complicated question of criminology. On one hand, we are very familiar with research on attachment theory. We know that removing a child 4 years or younger from their parent during that time is extremely traumatizing. Research from the CDC and other organizations suggests that it's akin to actually other traditional forms of abuse or even physical violence and how much it impacts a young person. But we have to counterweight this with the fact that a child participating in this program would be raised in a prison environment. Studies on this kind of phenomenon in European prisons, which are considered more progressive and have with a higher capacity than American prisons, show that there was a slower cognitive and movement development in these children over time. The counterpoint is that they wouldn't be compared to the general population, considering how crime and carceral systems usually affect people coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but that just goes to show how complicated this question is. And finally, these are kind of programs that would require significant capacity requirements in both training for staff and the nutrition for mothers and their young children. And if we don't fully invest and go all the way in these programs, we risk doing additional harm to their participants. So it's a really complicated question in general. However, despite the lack of specific research, Terpeel still draws significant praise from scholars and prison reformers alike. Certain scholars have cited it as an exemplar program for expecting mothers, and it's drawn praise from activist groups operating in this space, such as the Children of Prisoners Europe. So, what would something like this look like in the US, and should we do something like this in the US? Well, at the very least, it's clear that the need for it is somewhat overwhelming. In 2021, we had 168, 400 and so thousand women incarcerated in the US. And this is on the increase, a five-fold rise since 1980. Additionally, 70 to 90% of incarcerated women are single parents. Not just parents, but single parents whose kids would very likely be going to either a relative or into foster care, which means a lot of these mothers would potentially be the type of mothers who would participate in this program. Furthermore, of the mothers, 18.3% in state prison and 17.7% in federal prison, they have a child in this age range, 4 or under. And 4% of all incarcerated women in the United States, jails, prisons, etc., are pregnant upon entry. So there's an incredible amount of people who would be eligible for a program like this in the United States, and the need seems to be rising. Actually, a robust prison nursery program used to exist in the US until about 1970, but scholars aren't exactly sure why it started to dry up. Today, 13 states have some sort of prison nursery program, but they are A, not nearly as developed as their counterparts in Europe, And B, there's crisscrossing legislation that actually makes some of these programs kind of dangerous. In 9 of these states, they still have laws on the books that require women to remain shackled or bound while they are giving birth. So there's a desperate need here in general and even in the places with this sort of program. And you might be asking, what about Minnesota? Well, in 2021, Minnesota passed a law that's actually the first of its kind, where it offers a conditional release for pregnant inmates during their pregnancy and 1 year conditional release postpartum as they begin to raise their child. And this is a good step. However, that's still only one and the first year of that child's development. We still risk serious detriments in terms of attachment theory if we're making these mothers re enter prison after only 1 year. So, with all of this information, what should we do? Well, my policy proposal is yes and. We should work to nationalize and extend these Minnesota conditional release programs for pregnant and postpartum mothers in terms of both a longer conditional release sentence and national coverage, while additionally developing quality nursery programming for mothers who do not qualify. If you're comfortable with giving conditional release to these mothers, they should be able to do so, both because it will provide for the best development of the child and to relieve the burden on the prison nursery programs inside prisons. But then also, we have something inside prisons so that all mothers, regardless of the determinations of their eligibility for conditional release, can have some sort of resources for raising their young children. Additionally, by decriminalizing certain drug offenses, which researchers now actually understand to incarcerate women at disproportionate rates to men, and broaden certain defenses to in criminal law, such as the self-defense defense and coercion, to better account for how domestic violence impacts women, we can further reduce the amount of women who are entering prisons and jails in the first place. And finally, we need to institutionalize data collection practices on incoming mothers. You statisticians in the room might have cringed when you saw that 70 to 90% statistic earlier. That's because we have really, really poor data on if mothers and young mothers are coming into prisons or jails because it's simply not collected. So, overall, by imposing all of these, we can both demonstrate better quality care while curbing costs to begin with. So, uh, thanks. So, I want to conclude by noting that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, we had programs like these in the 70s, and there's vast ways that our criminal law can change. You can get involved and do things to make a real difference. Additionally, if you want to talk to me more about this presentation or on the Clemency Clinic in general, I have my email and phone number there. And with that, here are my references for nerds, and I'm going to pass it off to Amy Cohen to talk about criminal mediation.
Okay, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit and talk about the process of a case. So, when we were in the Netherlands on the last day of our trip, we met with a criminal mediator. And we don't have any pictures from this meeting, unfortunately, but these are some images I pulled from the Dutch Judiciary website. They're like kind of screen grabs from videos explaining the mediation process. So the Dutch use the word mediation, but what it kind of seemed more similar to here in the US is a victim offender dialogue. But along with that, it happens before a case is resolved, and then also it can result in some type of resolution between the victim and the offender. Um, and so the Netherlands started a pilot criminal mediation program in 2010, and then it became available across the country in 2017. So it's still relatively new. And basically, what happens is essentially the public prosecutor, which we're pretty sure just means a criminal prosecutor, or a judge in a case can recommend that a case go to mediation. And so then it gets referred to the mediation bureau who screens the case. They'll contact both the defendant and the victim and decide whether to actually go through with a criminal mediation. And the goal of a criminal mediation is to facilitate psychological healing, mainly for the victim, and then also determine damages. So, in terms of the mediation process, how it will work is that there's going to be two mediators in a comfortable and safe setting with the victim and offender. They'll do individual intakes with the victim and offender in a joint, and then move on to a joint session together. And, sometimes they might not move on to a joint session. That would be, for example, if the offender doesn't want to take responsibility, or if the victim's basically just looking to place blame. The goal of the mediation is to be a productive conversation. So they make sure to do that individual intake so that that joint session can move forward in a productive manner. And basically, the joint session is supposed to be restorative and end in an agreement. So, an agreement would be something like determining damages, determining restrictions on movement. So, the mediator we talked to, she kind of gave us a couple of examples. For example, if a victim doesn't, want to run in, maybe they shop for groceries in the same neighborhood, and the victim doesn't want to run into the offender when they're shopping for groceries. So then the offender will agree to, shop for groceries in a different neighborhood. Something else is, make kind of a decision on what to do if they do happen to run into each other, so that the victim kind of has a plan. They know what's going to happen, and it's just not quite as traumatic as it might be. And mediation doesn't replace prosecution. It's something that the judge might consider at the offender's sentencing, is whether the defender participated in a mediation and if it was successful. But it might not necessarily replace a prosecution, although the victim might decide they don't want to move forward with prosecution after the mediation. Um, but it's usually just something that the judge will consider at sentencing. And it's not something that you can like really qualify, like, oh, this person got 3 months off their sentence because they participated in mediation, because the judge will just cite it as one of the factors in determining their sentence. So the facilitators, the mediators, how they're trained is that they have a 9-month training course, and that's generally for mediators throughout the Netherlands. But then criminal mediators will receive extra training. They don't necessarily need to have a legal or criminal background, although the facilitator we met with had been a defense lawyer. Um, and so they become a part of the mediation bureau that I talked about earlier that facilitates the process in every Dutch court since it's been available. And there's a few goals that they're focused on during the mediation. So, one would be to avoid secondary victimization, find out what the victim is seeking out of the process. And one of the main goals that the mediator we met with emphasized was that they want to end in a resolution. She gave us a statistic that some 80% of mediations are successful. And what we understand that to mean is that they end in a resolution. I couldn't find any actual numbers on this. It kind of seemed like she might have just been ballparking. But about 1,500 cases are referred for mediation each year in the Netherlands, and then about 870 actually go to mediation. So a good portion of those. And the mediator we spoke with, she was super nice and knowledgeable. She was a big fan of the program. And like I mentioned, she did have a criminal background. So, one thing that we found really interesting is that there's really no restriction on the types of cases that can go to criminal mediation. So, we discussed criminal mediations in cases of murder, arson, and domestic violence. So, she gave us one example where there was a truck driver who hit and killed somebody who was on the road. And I guess that person was kind of in their blind spot. And that the driver and the victim's family went to mediation, and, during the mediation, she said that the family of the victim learns just like how racked with guilt the driver was. And, he apologized to them. And the family was able to ask the driver questions, about the victim's last moments, if he really didn't see her and just anything else, that could kind of help them get closure. And they also got to like go over a scrapbook of the victim with the driver. And the mediator emphasized to us that it was like a really restorative and kind of healing moment. And we also talked about a mediation in an arson case that had resulted in like several deaths in a building. And just it was really interesting to hear about the types of cases that go to mediation, and especially how early they all do go to mediation, because it gets a lot of answers a lot earlier for victims and families of victims, so they don't have to wait years to get answers to questions they might have. And it also gives offenders the chance to take accountability for their actions and try to understand what they've done, um, instead of waiting years for that either. Oh, wait. I was on the wrong slide. Oh, well. Okay. Um, so the I tried to compare criminal mediation into what we kind of have in Minnesota in terms of restorative justice. So in Minnesota right now, we don't have widespread restorative justice, which is like this type of victim offender dialogue I referenced. before sentencing. And actually, if you look at the numbers of DOC facilitated restorative justice in Minnesota, even after someone's already in prison, there's super low numbers. And I included like a link to the most recent DOC report that includes that information. And just for reference, in fiscal year 2023, only 6 victims received apology letters, and there was 1 victim offender dialogue that took place. And that's not necessarily for lack of trying by prisoners, but it's kind of a lack of the DOC facilitating, is what it seems to be to us. And even if, this restorative justice programming between victim and offenders does happen, it's happening years after the fact, unlike the criminal mediation that takes place in the Netherlands. And something that Professor Murray and I have been talking about recently is there is actually a restorative justice statute in Minnesota that would allow more for this kind of like victim offender dialogue, this type of like criminal mediation beforehand. And I didn't list the statute there, but like some of uh, the goals of the statute, if you look it up, include like to discuss the impact of the offense on the victim and the community, to provide support to the victim and methods for reintegrating the victim into community life, to assign an appropriate sanction to the offender, and provide methods for reintegrating the offender into the community. So it's kind of similar goals, but it's not really being utilized a lot in our understanding. I actually talked to a judge about this in Hennepin County, and she said she had only really seen it used in like low level juvenile cases. So there is a chance, there is a statute that would allow for something more similar, at least in Minnesota, which is interesting. And we've been trying to kind of let people know about it. But yeah, I found that the criminal mediation process was really interesting and just seemed to work really well. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about TBS, which is the Dutch approach to the overlap between mental health issues and crime. So on this trip, we got to visit the Beltic Center for Transcultural Psychiatry, which is where we met with a group of psychiatrists and legal professionals who introduced us to the concept of TBS. We'll kind of go over what it is, a timeline example, and then the downfalls and whether or not it could or should be implemented here in the US. There we go. Okay. What is TBS? So I'm not going to try and butcher for you what TBS actually stands for. It's a really long, hard to pronounce Dutch word that I'm not going to butcher, but it roughly translates to detainment at the government's uh, pleasure. It's very similar to the civil commitment procedure that we use here in the U.S., except it's happening this determination is happening at sentencing rather than after a person serves their criminal sentence. So, TBS is the system that was developed in response to the extremely high rate of mental illnesses among people who commit crimes in the Netherlands, which, of course, we know that mental illness in the criminal justice system is pervasive in the US as well. A panel of 3 judges can impose a TBS order in those cases where it's determined that the defendant will pose a continuing threat to society if they do not receive treatment for their mental health issue. When that order is issued, the defendant will serve all or part of their criminal prison sentence, and then instead of being released, they are transferred to a forensic psychiatry facility like Veldzicht to receive treatment before they will be released. 3 conditions do have to apply before a judge can impose a TBS order. The defendant has to suffer from a mental disorder, which means that his responsibility for the crime is diminished or absent altogether. The crime also has to carry a prison sentence of at least 4 years, and there has to be a risk of safety to other people in the public. The 2 primary goals of TBS are to reduce recidivism rates and then to protect society from individuals who commit crimes, but only on account of their underlying mental illness and deficit. So, as far as what is included as a mental illness or mental disorder for purposes of TBS, this can range anywhere from a personality disorder, something like schizophrenia, to a serious intellectual disability. But most interestingly to me was this also includes addiction. So this is kind of a timeline example of how a TBS order would be imposed in a criminal case. First, defendants have to be charged with a serious crime, which is most comparable, from what we could tell, to what a felony is here in the US. And then the defense lawyers can raise the defense of diminished responsibility. This basically means that the defendant is conceding to having committed the crime, but they're arguing that they are not responsible or only partially responsible because of their mental illness. So, to raise this defense, though, there must be two expert reports conducted on the defendant's mental state and their level of culpability before a judge can even consider imposing a TBS order. Those reports have to be conducted by two separate experts and they have to practice in two different disciplines. Now, in the US, we know that someone is either deemed competent to stand trial or they're not. It's a very black and white issue. But in the Netherlands, there's a 5-point sliding scale for this diminished responsibility. Those 5 points are full responsibility, slightly diminished, diminished responsibility, severely diminished, and then total absence of responsibility in general. Now, once the judges have determined the appropriate prison and TBS sentences, the case is finished, and then the defendant reports to prison. Now, theoretically, a TBS order can be for an indefinite period of time, however long it takes for the defendant to no longer pose a danger to society. Normally, though, a TBS order will be for 2 years at a psychiatric facility. After you serve those initial 2 years, the defendant's mental state will be reevaluated to determine whether or not they should be released or have their stay extended. If their stay is extended, then they will be reevaluated every 1 or 2 years, depending on what the judge and their therapist decide. Sometimes, though, if a person's mental illness is particularly bad and it's decided that sending them to prison would do no good at all to themselves or to others, they will not have to serve their entire prison sentence before reporting to a forensic psychiatry facility. They do, however, have to serve at least 2/3 of their sentence before they can even be considered to move on to TBS. A big factor in this is, unfortunately, bed availability at these facilities. There are only 13 of them in the Netherlands. So, like any other legal or political system, there are downfalls to everything, and there are definitely some ethical concerns with TBS too that are important to consider and be aware of. Firstly, it delays treatment for offenders who we have already determined and diagnosed have a mental illness. This means there's actually a lot of time for those people's mental illnesses to get worse and require even more treatment by the time they actually get to a TBS facility, especially with prison conditions being what they are. Critics say that a TBS order necessarily creates an obligation for the government to immediately get help for that person's mental illness since it's been determined by experts that they have a mental illness. Experts we spoke to, we did ask about this. They acknowledged this downfall of the system that you go to prison first and treatment second, but ultimately they argue that it is better than the alternative of going to treatment first and prison second because likely going to prison, a lot of or all of that treatment would be undone or they wouldn't be able to continue that treatment while inside. And one another downfall is, like I mentioned, TBS can be an indefinite sentence at the complete discretion of the judges and your therapist. The average TBS sentence in 2017 was about 8 years, even though most TBS sentences are only imposed initially for 2 years. So the problem with this is that in theory and also sometimes in practice, a defendant found guilty but with diminished responsibility can end up serving the same prison sentence as someone who was fully responsible for the same crime, but then they also end up with an additional period of involuntary confinement when having to serve their TBS sentences. So a lot of critics are saying that this is just a way to more harshly penalize the mentally ill because they are still having to serve their prison sentence and then a further sentence for their mental illness. And then the most obvious concern, at least as far as looking at its implementation in the US, is how much money this really costs. For the 13 forensic psychiatry facilities in the Netherlands, it costs roughly 1.5 million euros per year to run them, which translates roughly to $1.6 million. Obviously, the Netherlands, though, is a much smaller country than that of the United States, which means that if this was implemented here, we would need far more facilities and resources for this to actually work and be adequate treatment. That would also require much more money than the 1.5 million that the Netherlands spends on this. And though there are more, the last downfall I want to mention is just the lack of overall reentry services for offenders after they leave TBS or just prison in general. We did get to talk to a few people who have been to prison, served their sentences, and have now been released, and they expressed a lot of the same issues that we're seeing with reentry here in the US. There's a stigma attached to these people who are convicted of crimes, It's also more difficult to get a job there with a criminal record. From what we could tell, not as difficult as it is here to get a job with a criminal record, specifically a felony, but it does still make things more difficult. TBS also just generally extends the period of time that a person spends outside of society, which studies show that the harder or the longer you spend outside of society, the harder it is to reintegrate. So, what can we learn from the system? Should it be implemented here? How would it be implemented here? I think the first thing we can really take away from the system is transitioning away from our black and white competency standard and moving more to something similar to the Dutch 5 point system. Our system, like I said, makes this a very black and white issue, and the bar for incompetency is very high. Very few people are actually deemed incompetent to stand trial. So, by implementing this 5 point system, we could end up treating a much wider range of people who suffer from mental illnesses because it's likely that more of those people would fall into one of the five diminished responsibility categories. This would also help reduce prison populations by only sending those people to prison who need it and getting treatment for those with mental illnesses rather than sending them to prison. Second, something we can learn here in the US is that the Dutch DBS system, what it's doing is it's aiming to address the underlying reasons why people commit crime. Roughly 60% of Dutch prisoners right now suffer from a mental illness or disorder, and addressing those underlying illnesses and disorders does a better job at reducing recidivism in the Netherlands than sending people to prison. Of people who receive TBS treatment, 21.2% commit another offense after 9 years. The recidivism rate is much lower than those people who did not receive TBS treatment, which is 63.8%. So it is showing to be very effective. I think in general, we can also just learn from the way that patients are treated in these facilities versus the way they are treated here in the US. I visited one psychiatric hospital in the United States and it looked and felt like a prison. It looked nothing like Veldzicht. Mental hospitals also are known to treat patients more like prisoners than actual patients. But at Veldzicht, we were shocked by how friendly, inviting the building was. There were tons of windows, and it was relatively a warm space. It felt a lot more like a boarding school than it did a mental facility or a prison. There was also a ton of activities and programming that the center offer, which Anna will talk about a little bit more when she talks about our trip to Belgic specifically. But patients got to do woodwork, make candles, even work with metals and heavy machinery, and they could also sell some of those products that they made. The Velzic Center's big focus is on giving their patients as much freedom as possible, which is often not the case in the US. When we arrived in one of the wings, there were 10 to 12 people up walking around, watching TV, playing games, cooking meals in the kitchen. It was very inviting and communal. The psychiatrist we met with said that making sure the center doesn't look like a prison was definitely a top priority of theirs because it boosts morale, specifically since most of these people are coming directly from a prison. We did get some pictures. I couldn't include them of this center. I could have, but they were very blurry and hard to see. But it was very well decorated. It wasn't the beige and white walls and metal tables. It felt like a boarding school or some sort of dorm room. And lastly, we did discuss with some of the staff how it works when someone commits a crime, has a mental illness, but is not a Dutch citizen, because Belgic is the center where any non-Dutch citizen who's convicted of a crime and has to undergo TBS, they will go to Belgic rather than one of the other 12 facilities in the Netherlands. This is because they have a lot more transcultural resources than every other facility. And they explained to us that any non citizen who commits a crime and is deemed a candidate for TBS will serve their prison sentence in the Netherlands and receive treatment in the Netherlands before they are sent back to their home country. It's a very foreign concept to what we do here in the US. When they are sent back to their home country, that's also not the end of the services the Netherlands provides. The psychiatrist will work with their physicians at home to make sure that they can remain on any medications. If those medications aren't available in their home country, they will switch it up, and they'll just overall be sure to make sure that that person can continue treatment when they go home. Which again, not something we really do here in the U.S. We asked why they do that, and they said, well, to deport people without providing them treatment would be inhumane. And we all kind of laughed because that's exactly what we tend to do here in the US. But that is the rundown on TBS. And then Anna is going to talk about the center that actually implements this.
All right, so just going a bit more in depth here. This is the Melstick Center for Transcultural Psychiatry. They provide a safe environment for the treatment of people with acute, complex psychiatric disorders. And this is just a picture I found off of Google, off of the front. Here, it's a very pretty, very nice building, as Maya said, on the inside and on the outside. Okay, so going in with the history, in the late 19th century, it started out as an educational institution for boys. Um, it then became the first government asylum where detainees could be housed. Originally, their goal was not treatment, but punishment. Then, with the use of TBS and a couple different acts went into effect, and it now kind of is what it is today, where it treats a wide variety of patients. Some there on TBS, while others are there voluntarily seeking help. Currently, there are 69 nationalities represented by the patients here, um, which necessitates their use of transcultural therapy. So, what does this look like? So to accommodate its diversity, they utilize transcultural treatment. So for staff, this comes in many different forms, such as providing an array of musical therapy for, or musical instruments, excuse me, for music therapy, having knowledge about other cultures, being aware of your own cultural influences and biases and taking that to an account when interacting with other people. And then taking into an account where patients will return to after treatment and tailoring their treatment specifically to meet that need, as well as teaching Dutch as a way for patients to learn to express themselves universally. People who maybe are not from the Netherlands and don't speak Dutch. And so this is especially crucial for patients who will not return to their country of origin but will remain in the Netherlands. This is also pretty important because for many, trauma is very culturally specific, whether it's the type of trauma they endured or just how their culture views and treats trauma and mental health. Staff often will speak with countries and facilities outside of the Netherlands to get a better perspective on how to best serve patients. Um, I think I'm missing a slide here. Okay. So they implement a what works model, which consists of looking at each patient on an individual level and thinking about what works best for them specifically. So for some, that may look like more intensive programming if the risk for reoffense seems higher. For others, this means that treatment may be terminated early if they show really good signs of rapid success. Um, So they have a couple different types of therapy here. They have musical therapy, art therapy, sports therapy. And so with the artistic outlets, we'll say, encourage patients to use music and art as an outlet for expressing themselves and their feelings. So the staff here provides a variety of options, making sure to include different instruments and art supplies from many different countries. From all over the place, really. So this therapy is seen as getting the conversation started. That is, creative therapy allows for patients to express themselves on their own terms, and that usually opens the door to further conversations amongst themselves or with staff. Similarly, sports therapy is an exercise-based therapy that attempts to show patients the physical reactions certain emotions evoke. Like, for example, how when we are scared, we may notice that our heart rate jumps up and our muscles tense. So here is a picture on the right of us engaging in some sport therapy. The prompt was to stand on one of the benches and jump from that bench to the other. And so, with each turn that we took, the benches were moved further and further away from each other. The purpose here was to pay attention to how our bodies reacted. Were we stressed or fearful about making the jump, or that we would not make the jump? Were we worried or maybe embarrassed that we would probably fall on our faces? And then on the left here, I think Maya touched on this briefly. With art and being able to sell some of that art. Here are some of the birdhouses painted and made by some of the patients here that are up for sale. So overall, I think as everybody has really touched on here, the U.S. has a lot of catching up to do with other countries.
A little over 1:15, so I just want to thank you all again for coming, and thanks again to the wonderful students, Maya Grimm, Sam Beisman, Amy Cohen, and Anna Mitchell. Thank you.